Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book 12-Step Workshop. I'm going to put up the set-aside prayer. It has the word unmanageability in it, so that's the only difference. You're welcome to pray it or not at all, or however you want to approach this opening tonight. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps in you, for an open mind and a new experience with myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Well, we're crossing over tonight into the final stage of the first stage of the rocket launch. We took a look at step 1, that first stage of the rocket launch, a discovery, an experience, an understanding of, hopefully, something new for you, whether that be knowledge or experience with regard to step 1, that you do not have sufficient power to be effective, maybe in the area of unmanageability for the very first time, understanding the bedevilments, the cancer of the soul, the spiritual malady. Those are all synonyms. And then a desperate search for God. And now we're entering into that final phase of this first stage, which is to establish a relationship. Keep that in mind the entire time we're on step 3. From my standpoint, the purpose of step 3 in the big book, and I'll show you next week, not tonight, but next week, I'll show you the basis of that position, that attitude about step 3. Step 3 is about a relationship. Step 1 is an experience of no power in some fashion, maybe with regard to our addiction, maybe with regard to our lives and reality itself. And then we embark on a process of a decision, a faith decision, an empty leap of faith decision about God, just about God, the concept. We make a decision for ourselves. The balance of the step process, of course, is to clean house, 4 through 9. That's what step 3 is all about. It's the launching pad. It's the commitment. It's the beginning. Bill calls it the beginning of the journey. In fact, you'll note when you get to take a look at the step 3 prayer, even though you've prayed it many times, some of you know where it is in the big book on page 63, the second paragraph. But the step 3 prayer has no amen. I think it's significant. All prayers I know of have an amen. So be it. The prayer has been expressed. The conclusion of the prayer, amen. Why doesn't step 3 have an amen? But then, of course, we enter into the final orbit around the light. The rocket launch has 3 stages. The first stage is 1 through 3, a relationship with power. The second stage is a relationship with ourselves, 4 through 7. The third stage, the final phase of the clean house portion of this triangle. is steps 8 and 9, our relationship with others. 4 through 7, our relationship with ourselves. 8 and 9, our relationship with others, cleaning out the obstacles to those two relationships. And then entering the world of the Spirit, Bill says. As we get into steps 10, 11, and 12, the turning that was committed to in step 3, the turning, made a decision to turn. From what to what? From our self-centeredness to other-centeredness. That's what we learned in unmanageability. It couldn't be clearer, step 11, other with a capital O. Step 12, others with a small o. Bill says, keep our head in the clouds and our feet on the ground. That's a succinct summary of our program, our way of life. So is God necessary? We looked at that question. You have to discern whether or not the God word is relevant to you and what does it mean, and what would be a synonym for it as we approach step 2. Step 2 doesn't have the word God in it. It has the word power in it. That's not subtle. That's very much in our face. Step 2 is not about God. It's about our concept of God, our understanding of God, power, as we're going to interpret it. And we said, and we discovered in the big book process that it was a decision. Step 2, it doesn't say it in the big book as overtly as I say it here, but it says it if we're reading intelligently what Bill says on page 53, God is or God isn't, what is your choice? And all throughout that chapter, he's emphatic about it's our concept, not the books, not his, not AA's, not your religious tradition. This is the act of faith, that willingness to make that decision, which becomes the cornerstone of our journey through the arch to new freedom, he said. And so we enter then into step 3. After we make this decision about our concept, trying to understand, so what does Bill mean? Made a decision to turn. The word surrender is not in the 3rd step. The word surrender is not in the big book. My editor has done a word search. The word surrender is not in the big book, and I believe he said it's not even in the 12 and 12. It's an interesting word. I used it a long time to represent step 3 because I heard it in meetings and it sounded relevant. I hadn't given it much thought. I surrender, I give up, a white flag, I join AA. This sounded all good. And yet it's a misperception. In fact, it leads us into some misunderstanding of step 3. Surrender is a wonderful term for step 1. Defeated by our addiction and defeated by our life, I give up, I surrender. But let's take a look at step 3, made a decision to turn. I'm using my free will to turn. Our will and our lives. What does that mean? And it doesn't say over to God. Please, I'll emphasize this more than once, and you may get tired of it, but it's so important that we absorb it. We turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. What does that mean? Of course, as we understood God, coming out of step 2, Bill is faithful to that concept. So let's take a look at the big book, page 58, chapter 5. How bold, how it works. There's a story that an Al-Anon brought the big book in 1940 or 41 into a small group of alcoholic men. She was married to one of them, and she discovered the book, and she brought it in and gave it to them and say, hey, some guys back east have found this helpful. And they said, well, okay, we don't know what to do with it. And somebody looked at the table of contents and flipped to chapter 5 and said, well, it says here how it works. Maybe we should read that here today as a group. And it started in California, in Los Angeles, the tradition of reading chapter 5 in AA meetings. I've heard it more than once. I've heard it recorded and interviewed with very credible historical people in the Southern California area. I hope it's true. Makes for a great story. Rarely have we seen a person fail. Bill wanted to write never. That was in one of the manuscripts, one of the drafts. But the group said, you know what? Alcoholics are so contrary, ornery, that if you put never, they're going to try to prove you wrong. So why don't you not make it so black and white? He put rarely. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Now, we hear this, at least in AA, this material from pages 58 to 60, which is what we're going to focus on tonight. We hear it in meetings regularly read. And because we hear it regularly read, we become brain dead to it. So I'm going to spend some time unpacking it. It might seem a little tedious, but I think it's going to be very worthwhile, especially for the people in AA who have heard it so many times that it has no meaning to them. The key word, the operative word here is thoroughly. Thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There's lots of confusion and misinformation about that. Let's take a look at what Bill's saying, because he spends 3 complete sentences, clarifying this very point before he goes on. Obviously, he's making the point that rigorous honesty is, in fact, one of the primary ingredients of how it works. But here he's saying, constitutionally incapable. Pay attention to the words. Bill was a wordsmith. I try to understand the words that he uses from the dictionary and from the times that he used the words. There's very little ambiguity about that word. Constitution means their biological structure. Now he's going to reinforce that interpretation. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. See, it's a biological predisposition to a lack of capacity. Now, I don't know whether that means they're retarded or they're mentally incapable because of some type of biological deformity, or that they're psychopath or sociopath. Bill doesn't tell us that. But all of those people are constitutionally, by their very constitution, by their very biology, by their very physiology, incapable of processing reality. Now he's going to reinforce it with another sentence. They are naturally, by their very nature, incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. So he's really serving up the baseline here. This is the key ingredient, rigorously honest. Now, I do believe that that's a process. My sponsor, when I finally admitted in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that I was an alcoholic, and they said, get a sponsor. I did. And he said, call me every day and tell me what you're thinking, feeling, and doing. I want you to be transparent. I said, what does that mean? I want your insides and your outsides to match. And I began talking to him on a daily basis, and I did that for 10 years. Daily. I called him and I was accountable. He was training me in accountability. He was training me in consciousness, paying attention to my thoughts and my feelings and my behavior. And he knew that I would progressively get honest. And I wasn't honest for 4 years. Oh, I did an inventory in my first year, but it was an autobiographical inventory. He didn't know much about the steps. He knew a lot about AA and the appropriate behavior and protocols and how to be a good AA person by his definition. And I went to a meeting every day and I called him every day and I progressively got honest. But it was only after I worked the steps in my 4th year, between my 4th and my 5th year, I worked the steps out of the book like we're going to do with a man who had experience with the book and who had experienced the spiritual awakening as a result of the steps. And I got very rigorously honest at that point. I mean, life-changing honest for the very first time. So back to the book. Their chances are less than average. Now he's switching to the balance of the human race. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders. Pay attention. 2 categories, emotional, mental. So there would be challenges on both areas, not necessarily in the same person. But he says, many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. There's the key word. Do they have the capacity? Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like. In other words, our life of addiction. What happened? What was the defining moment where there was the change in our thinking and our feeling and our behavior? For some of us, it was a profound awareness. Maybe because of the steps, maybe because of going to AA, maybe because of going to church or a therapist's, that moment of clarity that many people talk about. And then others struggle for years before they actually get some traction with sobriety, with abstinence. I want to broaden the vocabulary because we're not here as alcoholics only. We're here as people who have a problem with addiction, mostly. Some of us are here because we want a spiritual awakening and we're not in any 12-step program. At some point, I'll ask for that, maybe by the time we start step 4. And what we are like now to see, in fact, a witness to the power of the fellowship and the book and the step process. But here's a very, very important sentence. If you have decided you want what we have, well, what do we have? Well, at the very least, if you're aware of somebody with recovery, or you're going to a 12-step fellowship meeting, you know they have something that you don't have, which is abstinence from whatever your addiction is. And even if you don't see that, you see them smiling and having a fairly decent time with their lives, making progress. If you have decided you want what we have, and you may not know what we have, but you are very convinced you don't want what you have, and are willing to go to any length to get it. Now, there's a line that's used a lot by sponsors and in meetings, and again misquoted. No, it's not standing on the street. No, it's not doing headstands in the corner. No, it's not fill in the blank of all the silliness that's talked about in terms of willingness to go to any length. The book completes the sentence after a dash because it allows us to pause. Willing to go to any length, then you are ready to take certain steps. This was one of the questions I asked you to ask yourself at the very beginning of the workshop back in January. One of those 4 questions. Are you willing to go to any length, and what does it mean? Here it is. Right here at step 3. See, this is the preface to step 3. This is the introduction to step 3. It's the warm-up. It's the prelude. Bill's leading us gently up to the altar. At some of these, we balked, these certain steps. Quite frankly, I would say at all of these, I balked. I don't believe there was ever a step that I didn't hesitate or delay on or procrastinate about. We thought we could find an easier, softer way. That's the human nature, let alone the addict's nature. But we could not. That's why we get back to it. Bill says there are only 2 disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. One is alcohol and one is God. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. That's very profound. You're either going toward the light or you're going toward the darkness. Remember, I used the dimmer switch and the light switch analogy for the spiritual awakening and the spiritual experience. The dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time toward the light. The dimmer switch goes down a notch at a time toward the darkness. It's either going up or it's going down. You're either walking toward the light or you're walking toward the darkness. There's no resting spot because that's human nature. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Well, for you perfectionists out there, we do the best we can, fully realizing it's not the best we can and doing it anyway. You can't do this wrong. The only thing that you can do wrong here is not do it. It doesn't matter how thorough you are in the sense that by your judgment and your criteria. I did the steps 3 different times with 3 different mechanics of the big book. Very wise, very experienced people, each one of them giving me probably 80-85% of the same instruction, but that 10 to 15% was a critical difference. And each time I grew broader and I grew deeper in terms of my awakening. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Well, that's the foundation of the work that we do right from the beginning in the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer, isn't it? It's reinforced throughout the book with different phrases that Bill uses, but this is the primary phrase that launched that prayer, that set-aside prayer. To let go of my knowledge and let go of my experience so that I can be taken to a place of new knowledge and new experience, areas that I didn't even know existed. Remember that we deal with addiction. He says alcohol here, but I'll broaden it. Remember that we deal with addiction. Cunning, baffling, powerful. It's inert. Alcohol, drugs, process addiction, food, it's inert. It doesn't have its own mind, its own will. It's not waiting to get us. That's silliness. It's a way of talking for us to talk about the baffling feature of our addiction. But let's be very clear. It's in us. It's in our capacity. It's in our knowledge. It's in our willpower that fails us. There's nothing that has a magnetic ability in terms of addiction. It's an inert material. Without help, it is too much for us, and that's the decision that we made at the end of step 1. There is one who has all power. That's the decision we made in step 2. That one is God. You may have made that decision. Of course, in the language of 1939, that was the only option they really had there, other than calling it higher power or spirit. May you find him now. See, there's the direction. Bill is pointing the way to the light. Unfortunately, some people get to a place where they have a teacher and they begin worshiping the teacher, or they begin worshiping the finger. And the teacher stands on the path pointing the way with their finger to the light. Half measured availed us nothing. This man who took me through the work the first time said, Herb, read that. 50% will not get you 50%. 50% will get you nothing. 90% will get you nothing. 99% will get you nothing. Well, I'm here to modify that just a little bit, because I know about 30 or 40% of you are perfectionists, and you're going to, oh, what the hell? I can't do it perfectly. Half measures. No. My experience is we do the best we can, knowing that it's not the best we can, and we do it anyway. And with that attitude, doing the best I could, thinking that I was actually doing the best I could, I had an experience. And each time I did this work, I had a new experience because I was more conscious. We stood at the turning point. Oh, step 3, made a decision to turn. You remember when we looked at the balance of Bill's story on page 14, at the very top, he had a summary of the program and the process. Simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. That's it. We are turning from darkness. We're turning to light. The Father of light who presides over us all, that concept of transcendence. We stood at the turning point. Bill again, he's leading us up on step 3. We asked for his protection and care with complete abandon. It's interesting when you really pay attention to the words, the thoughts, the phrases in the material in step 3. It's the most ideal of all of the steps. He talks in terms of absolutes. He doesn't use the term absolutes like the Oxford group did. They had 4 absolutes. Dr. Bob even used those in the early AA days, those 4 absolutes: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, something like that. This material on step 3 comes as close to those absolutes, which Bill eschewed in the big book. He didn't want to incorporate anything that had anything to do with absolutes for 2 reasons. 1, alcoholics wouldn't stand for it, but 2, he didn't want to associate with the Oxford group in the book. He had a great reverence and respect and gratitude toward the Oxford group for his own sobriety and his own spiritual awakening. The foundation for AA was found in the Oxford group, but he knew that it had religious ties, which would create a barrier for some people to come to AA if in fact it had any religious connotation at all. Connotation, let alone words that connected them. So he avoided the terms absolute. But he talks pretty much here. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. Can I do that? No, of course not. Can I be willing to be taken to a place? Yes, of course. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. Well, I'm not going to read the 12 steps. We will dive deeply into the meaning and the suggested application of them as we navigate the balance of this year in our workshop. So on page 60, many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Well, especially if you take an intelligent look at step 4, complete inventory, and 5, confession. Most people would be horrified at that thought. I had an exposure to confession because of my religious tradition and training. I studied to be a Catholic priest, as most of you know, for 7 years in a monastery. That didn't frighten me. But when I looked at step 9, that was intimidating. Going to make amends to all the people and institutions that I had damaged and misused. Fortunately, I didn't have enough consciousness to be reading ahead or to even be thinking about the implications of these steps. I just loved the meetings, and it felt like group therapy to me. Those first 4 years, that was the attraction for me, was the fellowship, the camaraderie, the sharing, the confrontation sometimes. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Don't be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. Well, there's 2 things here. Bill recognized that there's a percentage of people that are perfectionists. And so he's saying right here, relax. But he's also giving us an indication of his literary style. He doesn't use the same word in consecutive sentences. So here he's just given us a list of steps. But here in this sentence, he calls them principles. Practice these principles in all our affairs. That has some implications later on when we get to taking a look at unpacking step 12. Each of those steps has a principle. Many people have Bill never made a list of principles that I'm aware of. Many people have attempted to make lists of principles, practice these principles in all affairs. We need to know what they are. And I've taken those lists over time and paid attention to them and made a list of my own based on my knowledge and experience. The Way of Life document has a list of principles as I've seen them, as I understand them, as I interpret them, built on the shoulders of other people's work. And you might find them useful toward the step 12 material in the Way of Life document. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. That dimmer switch mechanism, it is one of the best metaphors. It goes up a notch at a time. It doesn't go up on its own. And my additional words for that metaphor are I lean gently into it. I put my shoulder against the dimmer switch. I press gently against the dimmer switch and move it forward and notch at a time, an inch at a time, a click at a time. We've got the phrase a day at a time, of course. That dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time. But Harry Thibault, the psychiatrist that helped Bill personally, as well as with the construction of the original AA program, he said, Bill got it right. The first 9 steps will be for the deflation of the ego at depth, but the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself. So that dimmer switch is on a greased axle. And it's wired to go backwards. That's why I suggest we lean gently into the dimmer switch, into the steps, into our way of living. Not with aggression and not with a lot of energy to wrestle it to the ground. No, that would be self-will. But our willpower is there to make a decision, to move toward the light. So I lean gently against the dimmer switch, moving it forward. That's my image of it. Otherwise, it has a tendency to slip back if I even relax a little bit. And I don't mean relax in the sense of easy does it. I mean relax in the sense of abandoning steps 10, 11, and 12. This, Bill says, is the daily work. He calls it a daily reprieve, that we're not cured of our spiritual malady. We're not cured of our unmanageability. We're not cured of our cancer of the soul. That our self-will is a condition that needs to be treated on a daily basis with 10, 11, and 12. The principles we have set down, notice the steps, are guides to progress. I love that. I use the term now, handrails. Principles are handrails, sometimes guardrails, for walking the path so that we can find the middle road and not slip off the edge. We have a tendency to go to one side or the other. Quite frankly, the book says lack of power is our dilemma on page 45. My own personal experience is lack of balance is my dilemma. I'm constantly getting bruises on my right shoulder and on my left shoulder from bumping against the walls. It's hard for me to continue navigating that middle path. Easier now than it ever was. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Again, Bill hammers home. Relax. Breathe in, breathe out. That's what I tell newcomers, and I consider certainly a newcomer the first year of their abstinence. The first year of their abstinence, not their effort to abstinence, the first year of their abstinence, I consider them newcomers because they're thawing out. I did. Took longer than that. Our description of the alcoholic. Well, that would be the doctor's opinion. Chapters 1, 2, and 3, wouldn't it? The chapter to the agnostic. Oh, that's chapter 4. Let's be literal here. Our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. The personal adventures, maybe from the stories in the back of the book, maybe our own story from steps 4 through 9. So now Bill is giving us a retrospect. He's warmed us up to step 3. Now he's going to look back over the shoulder at where we've been in steps 1 and 2. A, that we were addicts. He says alcoholics. First half of the first step. And could not manage our own lives. Second half of the first step. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. Step 2. We made that transition to a decision that I needed help and that help was available and that help is deep down inside of me. All part of step 4, chapter 4, all part of step 2. C, that God could, that's part of step 2, and would, that's the beginning of step 3. That's huge. God has the power, but step 3 says it's a caring power. We're turning our will and our life over to the care of. So would. if God were sought. That's how step 2 actually ended. Remember on page 57? When we drew near to God, God discloses God's self to us. God has come to all who have honestly sought God. Being convinced, we're at step 3. Well, you have to ask yourself, are you convinced of those 3 propositions? 1, I can't do it by myself. 2, there is a power. It's available to me. I get to name it and act as if it's real. And 3, I get to establish a relationship with it. Now, that's not the quote or the phrase from the big book, but it's my interpretation of step 3. That we're attempting to have a relationship. Very much like the step 2 diagram. We made a decision about power in step 2, but in step 3, we're making a decision for power, for a relationship with power. More of that we'll plumb the depths of pages 62 and 63 next week. That's the assignment. I'm going to articulate that a little more broadly in a minute. But staying with page 60, being convinced, we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life. What does that mean? Our will. Okay, that's my human function of making a decision. My life. Bill doesn't tell us what it means. But if my will is my function of making a decision, my life is clearly, from my standpoint, a function of the actions and the consequences of those decisions. Now, we will take a look at those actions and those consequences when we do step 4. So we'll have a much deeper technicolor, actually understanding and experience of those when we get there. Bill asks us these 2 questions right here. Remember, I told you part of his literary style in steps 1 and in steps 2 is to ask questions at the beginning of a process and then to unpack what his response is, what his suggestions are, what the recommendations are. Here it is. Being convinced, we're at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understood God. I don't know why he left out the word care there. Fortunately, it's in the step itself, so I'm going to stay with that. But then listen to these questions. Well, what do we mean by that? And just what do we do? Again, appealing to the 2 things that make us specifically human. I told you I would use that model throughout. The 2 things that make us specifically human are the 2 things that, in fact, are the primary components of our addiction, aren't they? Of our step 1 powerlessness. Our mind vulnerable to the obsession, and our will vulnerable to self-will, unmanageability. The 2 things that make us human are implied in step 2. We make a decision, God is, and my mind accepts it, and my feet behave as if it's true. Belief and trust. And here we are now at step 3, and Bill is asking us again, well, what do we mean by that, turning our will and our life over to the care of God? He's appealing to our mind so that we have some knowledge. I'm not going to spend any time on it today or even next week, because we've already done that. You've done the work of answering the question, well, what do we mean? Remember the assignment on pages 60, 61, and 62 on unmanageability? That's what we mean. We have free will, but it's not free when it comes to ourself, because we're self-will run riot. But we still are human beings with free will. Oh, we can choose God or no God. Because on our own, we're going to choose ourselves. So we're going to use that willpower in step 2 to choose God. And we're going to use our willpower in step 3 to choose our relationship with God. Now, part of the assignment going forward for next week is to read as diligently as I've just read this material, pages 62 and 63. And you'll see at the bottom of page 63, page 62, that Bill has an answer to the question, just what do we do? The answer to the question, what do we mean, are pages 60 to 62. We're self-will run riot on our own, and yet we have free will. We have a responsibility to choose God and to choose a relationship with God, as I'm framing it. At the bottom of 62, he answers the question, well, what do we do? It begins with, this is the how and the why of it. He's going to tell us what to do. And that paragraph has 3 relationships in it. On page 63, it has another relationship in it. In the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, it has another relationship in it. Bill doesn't say it this way, but he provides it. I'm merely surfacing it and making it very visible. And you'll see the standard of the absolute prevalent in those paragraphs. Don't be intimidated by that, but challenge it. What does it mean? Abandon ourselves utterly to God, voicing it without reservation. Whew. Pay attention to the first paragraph on page 63, a description of the promises. We hear a lot about promises in the big book. After the 9th step, pages 83 and 84, wonderful promises, wonderful contrasted to the bedevilments. You can see that contrast in the Way of Life document after the 9th step, if you're interested to see the contrast of the bedevilments that you studied and applied to yourself in your own experience on page 52. And then on page 83 and 84, those promises after you finish the 9th step. A friend of mine illustrated the comparison to show the dynamic of the turnaround. When I turn from my self-centeredness, which is the bedevilments, to my other-centeredness, which is God and the people around me, the bedevilments become the promises, almost word for word. It's pretty uncanny. I hope Bill was conscious of it when he wrote it that way. Page 63, that first paragraph, are the promises of step 3. Rich and full promises, but they're approximate. They're not as complete as step 9 promises. There's a prayer that Bill gives us, a step 3 prayer in the 2nd paragraph. You'll note in the instructions that I'm suggesting that you write your own 3rd step prayer based on the words in the prayer here, not to improve it, but to understand it. When you have to put these words in the book in your own words, you obviously have to understand the words in the book. It's a wonderful exercise. Pray about it, meditate about it. We've got a couple of weeks. I plan on unpacking it next week. and then having lots of discussion like we did with steps 1 and 2 in terms of the third meeting to unpack all of your thoughts and your questions and your experiences with this material. At the same time, look up the word alignment. It's in the assignment 9, I believe it is, to look up several words, but the one word I'm very interested to get really acquainted with is alignment. It's not in the big book, but it's the term I use to understand and experience step 3. More about that next week. Be thinking about what relationship does your step 2 decision connote? It has implications, the decision you made in step 2, in terms of the practicality of a relationship. The term I love to use, it's not in the book, but I love to use it in terms of this relationship, is what relationship does your heart yearn for? Yearn for. I love that richness of that word, yearn for, from the soul level, from the cellular level. What do you want and need in a relationship? Also read the step 3 chapter from the 12 and 12. Wonderful commentary. Each time we come to closure on each step, I'll be suggesting that you read the corresponding chapter from the 12 and 12. Next week, we'll, as I mentioned, unpack all of this and give you the final assignments. And then the following week, we will have dialogue at depth to the extent that you want to have it on step 3. And then as a group in 2 weeks, on Tuesday night, we will pray the step 3 prayer from the big book, and we'll pray it as a community. If we were all in the same room, we would stand in a large circle, filling the room maybe a couple times actually with this number of people. And we would hold hands and we would pray the prayer in a unique way that I will introduce you to. So, you'll note in the reading for next week, when you read it, please note that Bill continues the architectural analogy he started in step 2. In step 2, he said on page 47, willingness was the cornerstone. Willingness is the cornerstone of a spiritual arch through which you're going to walk to a new freedom. These are key concepts, which he reinforces here in step 3, and he calls step 3 the keystone. You could look that word up. It's an architectural word that connotes that at the top of the spiritual arch, at the top of the arch in an architectural construction vocabulary, that the stone that holds the entire arch together is the keystone. My own sponsor he's more mechanically oriented than construction oriented, and he talked about the linchpin that holds all the moving parts together. Step 3 is that important. It's a commitment to turn. It's not the turning. Please hear that. It's not the turning. It's the awareness that we need to turn away from my self-centeredness to other-centeredness. And as Bill very aptly pointed out, and you might want to reread all of that material. I didn't mean for you to skip it, pages 60 to 62. But I just want to remind you that you've already looked at it at depth and we've unpacked it at depth. So I don't plan on being redundant about that. But you might want to take another look at it just to refresh your understanding of it, your exposure to it. And remember on page 62 at the end of it, he says, neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. the same way he ended the description of addiction on page 43 with regard to the first half of the first step. On page 62, he ends the description of the unmanageability, the second half of the first step, in this absolutely same way. We're powerless. We do not have the power of choice about reality and about our self or self-will. That's the inherent nature, the flaw in us. Okay. So if you want to ask a question, share a comment, talk about your reading, your experience with that, any insights that you would have, raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you in the order of your raised hands.
I was very intrigued when you talked about will, how a will, like the definition of a will, and you said it's the human function of making a decision.
Yeah.
And it's I find that extremely helpful because, you know, I mean, I understand that my life has become unmanageable because of this will gone riot. But I didn't realize it's because of the decisions I make for my life and the actions I take based on those decisions.
Yeah.
So I don't know, you've unpacked it for me today, that in a new way that I haven't kind of received before.
It's a life-changing insight. So you don't need to completely get it. It's wonderful that the curtains have parted and you've been touched by it. Now just let it gently have its way with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's extremely powerful.
Yeah.
So when we turn our will, it's like, instead of making a decision of what am I going to do next, right? It's like, well, listen, like get, you know, right? Rather than do. Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why it's not passive. Step 3 is not passive.
It's not passive.
I use this term. It's a ferocious act of my free will. Yeah. It's about the most intense action that we can take.
Yeah. And that's where our humility has to be there, because
Bam. You're really getting it. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. Humility is really seeing truth.
Yeah.
Having a perspective. Yes.
Well, I have goosebumps, by the way, just so you. Oh, yeah, no, that's great. And so again, I mean, to unpack this, so that we turn our will and our life. So talk about the life a bit. So the will, okay, it's the decisions I've made.
We'll be talking lots more about that next week.
Okay.
When we talk more about the relationship. It almost has to wait until we have a fuller context.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay.
But the essence of it is, my will is my decision making. My life are the actions I take and the consequences that form my life.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Okay. And this is where, I mean, this helps me in terms of what that relationship has to be, because the relation is like, God, I want to receive what decisions I need to make to be aligned with you.
That's why that term alignment is so critical here, because for me, it puts in step 3 in the entire context of the entire step process. It answers the question why Bill makes it the keystone.
I am so glad you brought up a word that totally changed things for me. I wrote previously about power. I said, I am so hung up with the word power. It seems forceful, negative, a takeover, aggressive. And today you said something about how the principles, the steps are the guardrails And what I lack is not power, it's balance. And
Yeah.
that I can relate to. I
Yeah.
lack balance. They always say, find the middle, whatever end. And so that image just totally changes things for me.
Yep.
And so I thank you. I really do. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for acknowledging and emphasizing it, because it's kind of like the highlighter. It brings to people your words, translating my words, but they can hear it differently. So thanks so much for emphasizing it. Go ahead.
And excuse me, and for years I've been reading the big book, and I so resist power. I don't equate God and power because I think of those negative terms. So it's been very challenging for me to get, and you keep saying what we need is power, 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 and I don't want it. So thank you.
And in contrast to step one, which is about powerlessness or ineffectiveness, I want to be effective.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
I had a spiritual experience a couple of days ago, and it's step 3. It's always so timely what you're doing here for me, probably for everybody. That's God working, huh? So this last week, I had just tremendous turmoil and all my unmanageability, well, not all of it, but a lot of it, and stuff to do with my ex-husband and stuff about, some of the continuing financial ties and one of our kids. I mean, all the basic bedevilment stuff. You can't get any more, basic than that. And I was really struggling regulating myself and talking to my sponsor over and over and, praying and meditating and, doing some of my, step work, looking at my inventory and really struggling, trying to turn it over to God and seeking God, please, and I could just tell, I just couldn't give up. How can I give up control? Because if I don't go and fight, how am I going to get what I'm entitled to with this kid? And anyway, and then I just had this spiritual experience on Sunday where in my prayer, even where like I could wake up in the middle of the night, like, what am I going to do to retaliate? And that's just not who I am, but, it brings up survival instincts. But anyway, so when I was meditating on Sunday and God, said to me, when you see him in this mediation, you're going to melt because you're just, you feel bad for him too. And that's my confusion. Part of me wants to fight for what I feel, whatever. And the other part of me says, but what about him? And that's just me and whatever it is, my good stuff, my bad stuff. As it says in here, when I'm the producer, the director, I do have some good purposes and I do have some bad purposes. But the bottom line is I produce confusion, not harmony. And then I sat with some of the stuff you've been saying about you don't have to have the answer. And it was just enough for me to know that this is probably why I feel like I want to control, because I feel so out of control. Part of me wants to lash out and take him for every penny I can. And other parts of me say, you know what, keep your fucking money. It's so important to you. And me and the kid will stand on the street. It's not that dire, but of course, but anyway. And then when I got clear that that's my part, that I'm afraid that I won't, whatever. So I'm just now sitting with the fear and the confusion. And now I can feel like I'm letting God in and I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm going to go to a mediation on Thursday and I'm okay because I'm going to stay as calm as I can and knowing that I'm in a state of confusion and that's okay because I have God to guide me.
And hopefully a good attorney, right? And a good, tough Barracuda attorney that will protect you. Yes,
Right.
They're worth the money in those moments. And what I tell the men that I work with, identify the operating principle. What's the operating principle here? And it sounded to me like fairness is part of your value system.
Yes, big time.
Yeah,
Big
I heard
time.
it. I mean, you said it, I heard it. And so identify the various principles that will be active in this particular meeting and always operate on principle. Never your ego, never your emotions, never your wants and needs and your fears or your anger. Always operate on principle. The second part of that is always take the high road. And what that means is be generous. Be generous with life, be generous with the principles. I've never yet been betrayed with the formula. Find the principle, take the high road, and be generous.
Well, what does that mean? So you know what? And you're right.
That's up to you what it means.
Okay.
Yeah. No. I don't mean being a cream puff. I don't mean being codependent. Oh, no. But if you want to be fair, be fair. What is fair? Yeah. If you want to be balanced, what is balance? Yeah. If you want to consider his feelings, his concerns, and his needs, what does that mean for you? Which is all the things you said. I'm bouncing it back like an echo to you.
But wow, but you said it, the fairness. When I got the chance to see it, some of the stuff he's doing.
That's not your business.
Okay.
You protect yourself, but you don't become a bad person because he's a bad person. You maintain your integrity. I know you from your sharing. I mean, that's part of who you are in your soul, is a person of integrity.
Well, I'm happy you see that. Yes, integrity. It matters.
It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You don't have to be right, and you don't have to look like you win to other people. You don't even have to look like you win to yourself. Winning, from my standpoint, would be operating on principle and taking the high road. A person of principle, a person of integrity. Yeah.
So I was doing the assignment and about what I want, what I need in a relationship with my higher power, and what kind of attributes. And I was writing, the stuff that I've written before. I need compassionate God, a loving God, supporting, all that. But then something you said a week or two ago, which was that God, could be thought of, I think maybe you didn't say it exactly this way, but as a reality with a capital R.
Oh, I probably did say it that way. Yes.
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and realizing what reality is, what the truth is not easy,
No.
So I've kind of interpreted the step 3, turn my will and my life over to the care of God, as I understand him, as asking God not to show me his will, but just to allow me to see the truth and what reality really is. And then be accepting of that, because it was a product of my creator, and I've turned my will and my life over to him. So if he can show me what the truth is, and half the time I might not like it, but at least I have made a decision to turn my will and my life over to him, and anything that I recognize as reality and truth, I can accept.
Yeah. See, that's the heart of the Serenity Prayer, and that's really what I mean by the alignment, which we'll explore much more deeply next week. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
But then the stuff about the warm feel good, I need compassion, I need love, and all that, it kind of goes out the window,
Does it?
To some extent. I mean, well, not entirely, but I don't think about it as much, because I'm getting my support this in a different way.
It's less relevant. That's right.
And so I was just wondering if I'm getting away from what we're trying to do here, or
no, I think you're getting right into the bowels of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. That's encouraging.
Yeah.
So I think it's funny. Well, it's not funny. That this morning during my meditation, I was coming up with balance, middle ground, that I felt like such a key component. I mean, this morning I was thinking, this seems like the one key item, although I feel like there's like hundreds of key, most important things. But I think I feel like so many of us think that that our selfishness is self-care, and that we're having to find a healthier version of self-care, like this balance of not being so selfish. And because I've heard people ask the question, and I know I've asked it to others, even if not in here. It's like, well, what does self-care look like? How do I know I'm not being selfish versus something that is self-care, or that I'm not being taken advantage of? And so anyway, I just feel like it's all the talk of balance, middle ground. It just feels like the first time I've heard it. I don't know how many times you've shared it, but first time I feel like I've heard it. So
yeah. And so where does it take you?
Oh, I still don't know. I mean, it's the other things that were talked about. It's like, I feel like, you just said, you said this before, but a ferocious act. And it made me think of the times when I'm at work, I don't want to say losing my mind, but I'm stressed. I'm figuring out what I need to do. And it's like, I now will pause. I'll try to do, I'll say step 10, step 11, I'll try to pray, figure out what's really going on, and then try to ask, what would my higher power want me to do in this situation? And that has changed my behavior.
I'll bet.
And that, I didn't realize how I was being selfish before, and now I can see it. I'm not going to say in technicolor, like you sometimes say, but and the results are always, so far, the results are better than if I had behaved selfishly, even though I feel like it was a subtle version of selfishness. So, but the ferocious, it was like having to pause and be like, okay, wait, don't write the email you want yet. Right. And so that's where, like tonight, when you said ferocious, that might also be the first time that tapped into, because I feel like only in the last couple months have I been doing this, knowing a little bit more how to do it. So, but as to what the middle ground is, I still don't feel like I know. It's one of those in process. I don't know.
Well, but see, in what you're, I think, talking about is becoming more conscious.
Yeah.
And that's why the mind thing is so important at the beginning, that we know something, that we become conscious, so that eventually we can, in fact, pause and make a conscious decision about the action rather than the reaction decision, because the reaction decision is write the email, press send, and then go, oh, shit.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So again, this is a process. You're having more consciousness. You're having some experience. You're having some reinforcement because you're conscious of your lack of consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's so, this
but
is,
it's slow, isn't it?
it's very slow. And when I came into the program, I had been physically sober for 21 years, but I'd only found the program like four and a half years ago. And so when you were talking about the de-thawing process, I just heard that as like it was a physical thing. And I'm like, well, I got that.
Yeah, right.
And so, but I feel like it's this last year that I'm like, oh, okay, I'm de-thawing.
Yeah. Well, even as you just described it, that's the thawing out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a process.
Yeah. And I'm getting that more and slowly, more and more.
Yeah.
So, as always, thank you.
You're welcome. It's very organic. This process is now, Bill had the cataclysmic mountaintop, white light, huge mystical experience. All right. It was organic in that it changed the direction of his life permanently. But most of us don't have that. We have what's happening as you all are describing. It's kind of like, oh, oh, 2 years later, oh, 3 years later.
Well, and I've gotten by in life. I don't say well. I mean, clearly, I've had my issues, but most of my life has been lived up here.
Yeah.
And that I thought was my strength. And so
Yeah.
coming into this, even though you talked about up here,
Yeah.
I'm like, all I got to do is study, force it.
Yeah.
And
And thank you for saying that word too, because when I say ferocious, I don't mean force.
right.
I mean this awesome energy that we need to generate to, in fact, begin to change and even be willing to change. And you'll see more of that as we begin, because right now it's theoretical. Even at the conclusion of step 3, it's totally theoretical. But then we put the we release the clutch in step 4. If anybody is a shifter driver, and we begin going on the road with step 4. Yeah, that's the witness to the legitimacy of our commitment of step 3, that we begin step 4.
And agreed about the forcing versus ferocious. Like me pausing, that
Yes.
feels ferocious. That
Yeah.
doesn't feel forced. Getting, I'll
Yeah.
say, a response from God, or what I think God wants, that's not forced.
Yeah.
If I try to force it, that doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yeah. You got it. Yeah, you got it. It's not subtle, but it sounds subtle until you begin to think about its implications.
Right.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, as always.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment and say thank you for addressing some of the words in regards to and the consideration for the perfectionism or the perfectionistic people out there. It really helped me tonight because, like probably so many other people, I've read through this so many times, and yeah, those words like thoroughly and rigorous, it just triggers perfectionism.
You bet.
And yeah, I was just curious. I mean, like I heard you, and it kind of gave me, I don't know, a space. It allowed me to see that there is a space for me not to be perfectionistic in this space. But I'm still like, well, what does that mean? How do I do it? And that last share was pretty good too, about the force and ferocious. I appreciate that. And I just wondered if you had any other suggestions on questions I can be asking myself, or other resources that may have better insight on this bedevilment of perfectionism.
Yeah, no, I don't at the present time, other than to say, so obviously I do have something to say, that when you get into the 4th step, you'll begin to see how it manifests and the unhealthiness of it. So you're just, I mean, it's wonderful that you're stimulated to consciousness and asking questions right now. And I guess I have to say, hold the questions and allow that energy of lack of resolution to be an energy that takes you into the 4th step, where you can have some experience, where you will not need much more explanation from anybody. You will have an experience with this to give you some sense of an answer to those questions.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. The questions are so much more important than the answers. Because if I give you answers and you don't have the questions really existentially, viscerally, if you don't have the questions, the answers are just all up here. But if in fact you hold the question and then you take some actions like we're talking about, reading and praying and meditating and talking and writing, all of that brings it down into it, and it explodes in us as an experience. And explode might be too dramatic, and yet sometimes you'll hear and you'll experience that it's quite dramatic.
I've been struggling with something and I haven't been able to see what it is. And that is the intensity of making a decision. It's this recognition that if I don't make a decision, I get to actually stay in a certain victim consciousness. I get to blame other people. I get to blame God. And yet I actually now finally want to make an honest decision, and I'm still struggling with it. I still feel this, that the habit of being a victim is deep. It's old. It's a lifetime's work.
Yeah.
And the embarrassment that comes up in experiencing this is very difficult. Part of what prompted this is coming across this quote from Carl Jung. He says, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And as you speak about the struggle to do this work and how there are times when it's very difficult and dark, and then times when it's light and insight comes and the light shows, this speaks to that. And I'm having that experience. And I'm not hating it or hating myself this time around. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, and you're raising a really, really good point implied in your commentary, and that is taking the third step and praying the prayer is pretty mechanical. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy. But it's a commitment to begin doing the fourth step. And when we begin the fourth step, that's the evidence that you meant it.
Well, here's what's interesting.
It's not going to be the certitude or the feeling that surrounds the third step. It's going to be the fact that you have pen and paper and you've begun your fourth step. And then you can realize, oh, I really was serious with that third step.
Well, here's what's interesting. I just finished steps 4 and 5 with my sponsor, and I'm digging into step 6.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, as we come back around through 2 and 3, I missed something.
Oh, yeah.
I missed a lot.
Oh, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't feel good.
That's
no question.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, get over your feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's 100% my experience. Now, I wasn't even aware, as you're aware, that I was missing something. I was just seeing some new stuff. It never dawned on me that I missed it the first time. I always blamed my step guides.
Well, and here's what I get lost in is how much else and it's just this whole circle of I can't see until I can. And
but that's not a productive question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's a cycle. Right.
Yes. That's the question of a perfectionist.
Yep.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Herb.
You bet.
I love the balance term. I just love that. It's so much more palatable to me than a power.
Yeah.
It just makes life so much more better, like peaceful.
Yeah.
Green.
More doable.
Oh yeah. And I'm not sure if I'm a perfectionist.
Doesn't matter.
And
you'll know soon enough.
My life, at least until now, when I'm thinking about it, is there's never any gray areas. Never any, it's either black or white. And that has caused me so much trouble and grief because it's not all black and white. Most of it is down the middle. So it's that balance and having a guardrail as to it's not all black and white. There is balance, and going down the middle is often better and more peaceful and less grief than the other left or right, if that makes sense.
Well, so where are you with regard to your approach to step 3?
Balance. I like definitely balance.
So what was your decision in step 2 in terms of your concept?
Definitely there is a God. There is.
All right.
Actually, there always has been a God. It's just my concept of God has now changed.
So, and what does it look like now for you?
Serene and peaceful in that he isn't out to get me, so to speak, and that I can trust the process and trust that.
You know, you could focus on that one word, trustworthy. That might take care of it, because it's a very positive word and it will have lots of growth opportunities for you. Just focus on that. Whatever this power is, it's trustworthy.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a decision and a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then think about how does that translate then into practical behavior for you.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Excellent.
Yes, which I need to meditate on, because I'm not sure exactly what that is yet.
Well, that's, you know, quite frankly, these workshops are almost like guided meditations, as we're doing certainly steps 2 and 3, reflecting on the concept, reflecting on the relationship, reflecting on the turning, reflecting on the decisions. And so there's questions, and there's now reading, and now there's some writing for you to do, and each person will have their own interpretation and their own experience with it.
And one other thing is, even though I've been just doing this for a short period of time, I'm feeling much more at peace and serene in my life. So I'm starting to transform, and I'm starting to feel things differently than say a month ago.
All right. Yeah. And it'll go in cycles. So it's wonderful that you're experiencing that, but don't get used to it.
Okay, I know the hell's coming. I know.
All right, thanks.
I just wanted to ask further of your comment about humility. This is seeing the truth, and I felt that needed, for me in my mind, needed further information.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, I said, and accepting and living with it. Do you agree with that?
Yes, actually, that's exactly what I mean by it. We were having a conversation about reality there with one of the folks. And see, reality just is. And when I am humble enough to see it as it is, rather than having to make it conform to my story or my thinking or my feelings, that's, for me, that's humility. That's a perspective. That's the perspective of truth, living in reality as it is. That's humility for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And if I may offer my concept of power, higher power, what has come to me during this journey is source.
Yeah.
The term source, and because then it's a entity from which something comes and can be obtained, and in that sense provides me with the resources that I need, the assets that I can draw from.
Yeah,
So,
and wonderful words and sentences and comments, and hold it and attempt to make it a little more personal.
well, the reason I went this way this time around was because I was trying to find a place that felt comfortable but wasn't overly humanizing it for
Yep.
me, because that tends to be where I had gone before.
Yeah, no, wonderful challenge. Nice. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, you bet.
I want to share an experience that I had based on what I'm being in these, being in this workshop and what's happening to me. And based on what I'm learning, I had a really dark day yesterday. It just was. I fall into some type of a darkness. But I know today that in that darkness, that's where I find the light. And I had this like aha moment. And all of a sudden I realized how crucial this decision, that the God that I'm looking for, the God that I need is that gentleness, is that from now on, I have an indicator based on my actions if I'm living in that consciousness or I went back to the unconsciousness. It's these actions. And then all of a sudden, this word came to my mind about a gyroscope. So I just looked it up for a minute. And what I saw was that the axis of that gyroscope turns based on the orientation of the disc that's on this gyroscope. The axis is free. And that's what I realized, that it's based on my distance or my closeness to the God of my understanding, to this gentle, vast, compassionate, broad, not constricted, that will manifest itself. It's based on where I'm positioned. Either I'm close to this axis, or I'm far away from this axis, and I have that freedom. That's what I finally realized, that I have that freedom. I have the freedom to move myself closer or to move myself further away. And based on where I am, that's what's going to be revealed to me. Not like I am going to reveal anything. It will be revealed to me based on where I position myself. And it was so freeing. It was this freeing feeling and this calm feeling. And I went to bed so free. So,
and play with the words of, rather than far away or closer, more conscious of its proximity or less conscious of its proximity. Because I don't think that there's any movement on the spirit's part. I think the movement is on our part.
Yeah.
We don't move away, we just become unconscious.
I can hear that.
Yeah, so just while you're allowing this to have its way with you, consider these other dimensions.
And it just feels good.
Yeah.
I'm finally learning what really good feels.
Yeah.
I didn't know what good felt till now at all. I also want to just say one of the spiritual guides that really helped me is Eckhart Tolle.
Yep.
And I listen a lot to his things, and I stay there with it.
Yep. Lots of spiritual writers will become much more rich and alive as a result of the work we do here. Please join me in the prayer of St. Francis. This is the best articulation of the process of turning and the promise of turning. Lord, make me a channel of your peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds, it is by forgiving that one is forgiven, it is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen.